Hi friends, welcome back to Literature Guide. Today's video is about one of the important topics in English literature. I am talking about Coleridge's distinction between fancy and imagination. Coleridge has made distinction between the two faculties of human mind, fancy and imagination. This video will be useful for the students who have been taking the competitive exams such as NET and SET exams conducted by UGC India. This video will also give you information about primary imagination and secondary imagination and the difference between the two. If you want to get more information about the topics, you can visit the website. The link of the website is there on this screen. I am very much thankful to my subscribers and non-subscribers for their staunch support. If you really like the content produced by this channel, do like and subscribe Literature Guide. If you have any views or suggestions, you can make a comment in the comment box below. You can also suggest some topics of English literature to me so that I can make videos on your suggested topics. I don't want to waste your time. Let's dive into a video and enjoy the video.
Fancy and Imagination by S.T. Coleridge. Both William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge had imperfect agreement about the role of imagination in poetry. In his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, William Wordsworth constantly emphasized the superior nature of imagination, rejecting reason or intellect. Coleridge also has the same preoccupation as he describes to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. Another phrase employed by Coleridge is the shaping spirit of imagination. It is clear that in Romantic poetry and criticism, there is a constant effort to redefine the role of imagination, in other words, to create a new aesthetic principle. Coleridge again, unlike Wordsworth, is very clear about the role of the poet. He states, "The poet describes in ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity, he diffuses a tone, a spirit of unity that blends and fuses by that synthetic and magical power imagination." This is a constant attempt in the criticism of Wordsworth and Coleridge. We should also notice that for Coleridge these differences between fancy and imagination, and between primary and secondary imagination are not merely literary problems, they are based upon philosophical and psychological theories. This shows that Coleridge, while defining these concepts, was highly under the impact of the German philosophy, particularly that of Immanuel Kant. Coleridge points out that imagination becomes a bridge, a link between our sense impressions and total understanding of reality. For Coleridge, imagination is capable of penetrating into the ultimate truth of things. Coleridge is rejecting the idea that the mind is only a passive or silent spectator. For him, the mind becomes very powerful, or as we may say, ideas are realities. This then is the background to his theory of imagination and its divisions as made by Coleridge. The two terms fancy and imagination, Coleridge points out, have suffered because of common usage. We tend to think that the two terms are identical. Coleridge likes to make this difference very clear in his critical ideas. He gives us an example. He says, Milton had a highly imaginative, Cowley a fanciful mind. Now it is clear that Coleridge is discovering something superior and different in Milton which Abraham Cowley does not possess. For Coleridge, fancy and imagination are not two names with one meaning, they are different qualities to be found in different poets. Imagination for Coleridge dissolves, diffuses, scatter in order to recreate, it struggles to idealize, to unify, it is essentially vital. On the other hand, Coleridge states that, fancy is different for it deals with fixities and definite. Coleridge further points out that, fancy is only a mode of memory, something we have by chance and volition. Imagination, on the contrary, is a divine gift, the poet as an inspired creature, the magic or the vehicle of the spirit. This discussion regarding the difference between fancy and imagination is in chapter 13, but it is incomplete and left abruptly. Coleridge points out that, the mind becomes mechanical, a mere association of ideas, nature without life under the impact of fancy. Imagination is not mere copy or imitation, it means a power which the artist can use only at his best. A further distinction made by Coleridge is that fancy tends to be too personal, subjective, and erratic, whereas imagination is objective and universal. The basic difference: what the imagination perceives and communicates is valid, fancy is eccentric. Coleridge in chapter 18 is rating imagination as superior to the act of creativity. According to Coleridge, fancy is a mode of memory, a passing idea, a caprice of the mind, a floating notion, non-material, it can roam at will into its own chosen regions, it is blended with choice empirical, it pleases but it does it within definite limits. Imagination is different, the supreme source of truth for the artist and the philosopher. Imagination is transcendental, cosmic, universal, whereas fancy is basically a narrower activity, a matter of choice dealing with fixed ideas and realities. To sum up the entire direction of Coleridge's definition, the manner in which he judges John Milton and Abraham Cowley would indicate that fancy here becomes an entirely different mental activity done by choice, an act of the waking mind. Imagination, as in Milton, has divine frenzy, something supernatural, a sense of unity and a central vision. This is, as far as we can interpret, Coleridge's distinction between fancy and imagination. Poetry as a creative act based on imagination, and poetry as a mechanical act based on fancy. The completeness of this discussion by Coleridge becomes their great limitation. The chapter 13 of Biographia Literaria deals with the distinction between the primary and secondary imagination, and it has been described by the critic George Watson as the Waterloo of English aesthetics. The charge is obvious. The two concepts, fancy and imagination, have been developed in an incomplete or sketchy manner. This is because those concepts cover the area of philosophy and metaphysics. The primary imagination for Samuel Taylor Coleridge then becomes the living power and prime agent of all human perception. Coleridge elaborates this idea further by stating that it is in the finite mind, an echo of the eternal act of creation, the infinite I Am. This brief definition has an unlimited scope for interpretation. Coleridge perhaps means that individual, although living in a finite and temporal world, has some awareness of the indefinable, the boundless, the infinite. He would also say that in the mind of every person, there is some desire, instinct, some awareness of belonging to a cosmic reality. The idea is Platonic, and Coleridge shows this impact very clearly. The primary imagination then is important only from a conceptual angle or a notional concept. It is something which is there in every person. The secondary imagination becomes the major concern of Coleridge. There is a close relationship of the secondary and the primary imagination. They are, as Coleridge says, coexisting with a conscious will, differing only in degree, in the mode of operation. Coleridge's explanation as regards the secondary imagination is more explicit because it deals with the artistic process or creativity. For the artist, the task is well defined. He looks for order, unity and synthesis in a world of diverse confused experiences. The secondary imagination is an act of recreation, it struggles to idealize and to unify, as Coleridge says, it is essentially vital. The primary imagination then is in every human mind. The secondary quality is a very rare, exclusive active capacity which we call the artistic process. The secondary imagination makes the external, the internal to make nature thought, and thought nature. This is the supreme work of a genius or a rare writer. The secondary imagination is a faculty of great literary geniuses, the classics. Coleridge gives examples of Shakespeare and John Milton. A writer's genius can be assessed even from a phrase or a brief line, for example, the wine dark sea, Homer, or calm of mind, all passions spent, John Milton, or a line we are such stuff as dreams are made of and our life is rounded with a sleep, Shakespeare in Tempest. These are examples of great moments in literature. For Coleridge, these are examples of the secondary imagination. Coleridge pointed that there are some qualities essential for a poet, the power of association, imagination and sensibility. He also uses another word for the secondary imagination and calls it the symplastic imagination, the artistic, the creative imagination. Poetry transforms reality into a superior truth and beauty through the shaping spirit of imagination. Poetry looks for a synthesis, a unity in diversity, an ideal in a world of reality. The artist has to work with imagination where, as Coleridge says, the subject becomes the object. This quality is the productive and reflective power. It is a beautiful phrase. Coleridge calls it the synthetic and magical power. Critics point out that the primary and the secondary imagination reveal only the degree of the basic quality. You have to distinguish between imagination as a universally active power which is primary, and imagination as a special faculty as a creative or poetic power which is secondary imagination. You must have two images before you, the divinely gifted poet and the poet as the organizer of his emotions. Critics point out that the primary imagination has remained a vague, uncertain concept. The secondary imagination is Coleridge's great contribution to English literary criticism. The critics W.K. Wimsatt and Cleanth Brooks summarized up this argument in a very logical order. Imagination, according to the writers, for Coleridge reconciles sameness with difference, the general with concrete, idea with image, the representative with individual, order with emotion. The purpose of imagination is to bring about a synthesis between art and nature. Please subscribe Literature Guide.